Hey class, as promised, we have our first lecture. So this week I want to set the stage and discuss a few things that made the ground fertile for the Reformation. The Reformation was not something that just happened without any kind of preparation. It wasn't something that Martin Luther just woke up one day and thought, oh, I think I'll go nail these 95 Theses to the door and see what happens. No, there's a lot of things going on within Europe during this time period that really let uh, the that really laid the framework for the Reformation to be fertile. That really led the framework for the Reformation to be able to take place, to grab hold, and to kind of spread like wildfire. And so, our first lecture is going to focus on the things that made that possible, the things that made um, uh, the Reformation possible to actually take hold, to dig in, and to really affect all of Europe. And so, the best way to think about this is to think of a three-legged stool. Uh, so here's the stool, and that supported by three legs. So the Reformation would be the seat part, and it's supported by these three individual legs. And so these events by themselves would not have been enough to spark the Reformation. However, the combination of all three allowed the Reformation to ignite and spread. And so each of these things that we're going to discuss forms a leg for our three-legged stool. Again, without one of these, it probably would had not have been as impactful as it could have been. But these, with these three elements, it really allowed the Reformation to take place and spread. So this stool helped to begin and was itself influenced by the changes in Europe. And so these things, again, they helped to begin changes in Europe, and they were also influenced by other changes taking place in Europe. Because you have to remember, life is not done in isolation. Life is done being impacted by one another, and our church is impacted by another church, and our community is impacted by our churches. Our church is impacted by our community, and so this that just different segments, regions, atmospheres, different things in culture and society all impact and influence one another. And so again, these things were broad. The changes we're going to discuss were gradual to the point that most people didn't realize that they were happening until you can stand back and look 200 years, in the past, 400 years ago, 500 years ago at this point. And so, again, these changes are broad, but they were gradual. And so, a lot of people in your day-to-day life wasn't necessarily seeing and thinking that all these different things were changing. But when we look back, we can see it with a clearer picture. Hindsight is 2020, they say. So when we look back, we can see what took place, what led up to it, and the efforts, or excuse me, and the effects that it had. Um, it reminds me of some of the political situation that we find ourselves in today. That many people are surprised by the rhetoric of the candidates that the election that we just had last year. Um, People were kind of surprised by the rhetoric and just the uh, kind of the uncouthness of some of our candidates, and so especially with candidate Trump when he was a candidate last year. But there were others who were pointing out that this situation was really 30 years in the making. People no longer seem to want civil discussion and compromise, but they want some kind of dictator that they can just push through an ideology. And so it's similar to that. It catches some by surprise, but in reality, this kind of harsh rhetoric from the candidates really been in the making for a while. And we've slowly seen a downfall in wanting civil discussion and um, compromise, but really rather people just trying to push an agenda through onto everyone else, regardless of anything. And so Um, the three things, the three legs to our three-legged stool, excuse me, are nationalism, science, and corruption. Those are the three things. Those are the framework that allow the Reformation to grow and to take place and to spread. So we want to talk about nationalism first and foremost. So what we see is that there's a rise of nationalism in Europe. So those outside of Europe were enemies based on religious ideas. In general, what you saw outside of Europe was like the kingdom of Christ versus the kingdom of Mohammed. Christians and Muslims were at odds, and it was very much based on religion. In Europe, though, everyone was a Christian because they lived in Christ's kingdom, that is, in the area that was the Holy Roman Empire. For them, being a Roman was equal to being a Christian. In Europe, if you were a Christian, uh, in Europe, you were just considered to be a Christian during this time period. Again, outside of Europe, it was very much religious distinction or religious warfare of kingdom of Christ versus kingdom of Mohammed. But inside Europe, there was definitely this unifying ethos, this unifying mindset that, hey, I'm a European, I'm a Christian. That Christianity really just had the lay of the land, the law of the land during this time period. And so what you see, though, is that people eventually begin to think differently. Whereas before, you just said you're European and you're a Christian. That's just it. But people eventually begin to see themselves as German or French, and so while they're still part of the Holy Roman Empire, there's now a more nationalistic tone, an idea beginning to grow and take place. What you see is that there begins a shift in thinking about who they are. They begin seeing differences such that they were not thinking of themselves as citizens of Rome first, but were beginning to gather together based on self interest affinity people groups. Like people are North Carolinians more so than United States citizen. So if you were to ask someone, if we were in person, we were having a conversation right now, we were asked, where are they from? You're more than likely to say North Carolina than you are to say the United States. And so this is just the mindset that people are beginning to drift towards and to move towards. You're far more likely to say what state you're from rather than the county or the country. And so, like I said in the intro video, I work for a logistics company. I meet different people all the time. That question inevitably comes up. They almost always reply with a state, but they rarely, no one ever says, I'm from an America. No one says that. It's simply, oh, yeah, I was born in New Jersey, New York, Tennessee, those kinds of things. Now, I was born in America. And so that's the similar shift that we see taking place in Europe, is that they're no longer identifying as Europeans first, but more as German, French, Spaniard, those kinds of things. And so people begin joining people who are like them. People were German rather than Romans. There begins to be something else that brings people together more than just Rome. And so this results in Christianity then becoming secondary as the primary identifier. The nationality becomes distinguishable from Christianity or from religion. So we can all be Christians, but our people group is important. We see ourselves as Americans more than Christians. We have more in common as Americans than religious affiliation. And so, again, what kind of binds us, as citizens of the United States, is that we're citizens of the United States. And you no longer really have to be religious to be a citizen of the United States. And so, again, similar development taking place. There begins to be other identifiers taking place that become more prominent as the primary identifier. So what you see is that religion begins to fall into the background as the Reformation stuff is beginning, which is, I think, a good thing. because once you separate Christianity from nationality, then Christianity is really best to thrive. Where there is a sense of coercion to join the Christian faith, then genuine Christianity begins to take a hit. So, given this shift in thinking, then uh, other religious expressions slowly become okay because the new number one unifying factor of people is nationality rather than religion. And so, again, because people begin to see themselves as Germans first, or French first, or Italian first, those kinds of things, because people began to see their nationality as the primary identifier, other religious expressions then begin to be okay, because that's no longer what holds people together and what unites people. So then the second thing that we see taking place, the second part of our three-legged stool is science. And when I say science, I'm not necessarily referring to biology, but more a broader term for discovery. This reemerges in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Dark Ages had lost some sense of discovery because Christianity had said that the truth would be revealed. And so people really gave up on kind of that sense of discovery. But again, that begins to be rediscovered, reemerged in the 14th and 15th centuries. Again, not necessarily thinking like hardcore biology stuff, but just the sense of discovery. And so at this time, the church extended to every part of society and culture, far beyond just religious stuff. What the church was saying at the time was to do and believe what they tell you to. The church want to consolidate and have the power, and their influence was far beyond religious life, and their message to the people was just do and believe what we tell you to. And so as a result of this, people just quit thinking and they just receive what the church tell them. But now what's taking place is that people start discovering and learning for learning's sake. And it was not tied to religion. People began to independently study science apart from religion. And so we see the rise of the university and science and religion starting to diverge. So people begin to see that the church was wrong on some things. So with this, they break away from the established authority, which is the church. And scientists then become their own authority through discovery. And so that is important because it breaks down the existing authority. As scientists begin to discover for and learning for learning's sake, then it really has an impact on the church. And so in their ability to have authority and influence in people's life, if people are now independently able to prove wrong some of the things the church had said. So when authority breaks down, people need a new authority. And in this case, we see plurality. We see an openness to multiple religious expressions of Christianity and even Islam taking place. We see reason, we see other schools of thought begin to develop and really try to vie for that new place of authority in people's lives. And then we get the Enlightenment, and this creates fertile ground for the Reformation to take root. So what you see is that science destroys the existing authority, which was the church, which was the papacy, and they begin to look elsewhere. And some do find that historic apostolic Christian faith, but other people turn to science and begin to try and assert their own authority, those kinds of things. Then the third part to our three-legged stool is corruption. So in the Middle Ages, you get Renaissance popes and priests, those who love big buildings, art, they marry women, have illegitimate children, and so forth. The popes really begin living like other rich and powerful and influential people. And really, the papacy just becomes another institution of the rich and powerful. And so this is happening, and people are getting tired of it. People are getting tired of the church and its leaders living like every other king and prince. And so, quote unquote, as tech improves, people begin to find out what's going on. The stories of corruption begins to spread more quickly and more easily. The corruption becomes rampant, and people begin seeing that some kind of change needs to happen. And so, even from people who don't want to leave the church, like Luther, when he posted his 95 Theses, he didn't really want to leave the church. He had made a vow to it, but he realized that there were some things about it that needed to be reformed. Luther didn't set out to start a new church, to start a new denomination, to start a new tradition. No, he started out because he wanted to reform the church. And so the point for us in this leg is this, that where there is power, there is often corruption. And this is a warning for putting power in the hands of one person, even if it is the church. And that's a message for today as well. That's why the Bible says to have a plurality of leadership, where, again, not everything is centralized into one person. Because, again, where there's power, there's often corruption. And so Europe had changed, and it's now ready for the Reformation to take hold. This convergence of these three things coming together with the corruption and the science and the nationalism and those kinds of things, they really come together and make this perfect storm for the Reformation to take hold. Again, one of these probably wouldn't have been enough to break the papacy, but this was a perfect storm for change. It wouldn't have happened if all three didn't occur at the end of the 15th century. There were other factors, of course, but these are the main ones. These are the main factors. So, now the calm before the storm was the Renaissance. And these three elements created a rebirth of learning, a rediscovery of what life was like in the Roman Empire before the infusion of Christianity. So, the Renaissance was kind of a return to pre Christian Rome. The intermediate stage between the Middle Ages and the Reformation is the Renaissance. So after about 1,000-year period of church rule, there was this classical period, which was a reemergence of classical literature and a massive emergence of learning. The motto of the Renaissance was ad fontes, which meant return to the sources. So in this, people began to think, if we want to recapture the glories of the faith, we need to go back to the sources for which they come from, which was the scriptures and the writing of the church fathers and their interpretations. So one person that served as a bridge between this work taking place in the Renaissance and Luther was a guy named Erasmus. So Erasmus lived from 1466 to 1536. And he says, you know what? Let's actually read the Bible. Let's just all stop, pause, take a moment just to read the Bible. And all they had was the Latin Vulgate at the time. So he begins to collect manuscripts and the interpretations and writings of the early church fathers, and he develops a critical edition of the New Testament. And in so doing, he realizes that there's a lot of things established on faulty translation. One example is Matthew 4:17. Jerome said that it should be do penance, but Erasmus said it should be penitent. So in this way, Erasmus was a bridge to rediscovering authentic apostolic Christianity. So with the invention of the printing press, his ideas were able to spread. And so Erasmus was huge, again, in being that bridge between the Renaissance and Luther. His work in creating a critical edition of the New Testament was fantastic. And you see that in the difference between do penance versus be penitent. So, is it doing something or is it having a repentant heart? And so, which leads to vastly different conclusions. And, thankfully, we have enough technology and history and resources to, it is that repentant heart, not doing penance, that is the correct translation there. But nevertheless, that's what's kind of leading up to Luther coming on the scene. That's what's leading up to the Reformation really taking hold and spreading like wildfire. Just this idea of, again, new learning, returning to the sources, science, discovery, nationalism, all these things coming together, colluding together to allow the Reformation to take place. So next week we'll begin to start looking more at Luther and some of his work and some other things taking place in the Reformation time period. Don't forget to go and enter your discussion question. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Take care.